Viene espulso pure Gregucci, ma improvvisamente nasce il fatto dirompente, cioè prima che riprenda il gioco l'arbitro espelle Soviero, probabilmente non sappiamo, forse avrà offeso
per proteste, sì, sembra
la dichiarazione ufficiale.
Però ha capito, un minuto o 30 secondi prima difendeva la decisione dell'arbitro e a questo punto questo non è più un fatto da giudicare tecnicamente cosa ha fatto l'arbitro, questo è uno che ha perso letteralmente.
The man you just saw goes by the name of Salvatore Soviero. When one thinks of the great Italian players to have graced the beautiful game, his name is not one that immediately springs to mind, and were it not for his combination of hooks and jabs, his name would be among the many others lost in the pages of football history. And yet, remarkably, he would not go on to become the defining figure of this particular match. That accolade would go to this man. We wouldn't know it at the time, but the performance of referee Luca Palanca would prove to be the trigger for a cascade of events so seismic that they would shake the foundations of Italian football to its core.
Ed è una vergogna!
In this seemingly insignificant match, Palanca's decisions were like ripples in a pond, imperceptible to most, but carrying the weight of impending catastrophe. As the final whistle blew, signaling the end of an ordinary game on an ordinary day, nobody could have fathomed the chain reaction his decisions would initiate. It would lead to the unraveling of a meticulously crafted facade, a web of manipulation and deceit woven by the powerful figures who controlled the destiny of Italy's most revered clubs. Palanca's questionable calls would lead to the exposure of the rot festering beneath the surface, a beautifully sophisticated system of manipulation shielded by the shadows of prestige and influence. The towering executives who once wielded untouchable power would find themselves teetering on the brink of downfall, taking Italy's most prestigious clubs with them. In a country where the sport is considered by many to be of greater importance than religion, the exposure would prove to be a reckoning. It shattered illusions, shattered idols, and forced a collective soul-searching about the true cost of the beautiful game. Luca Palanca, a name once obscure, would prove to be the catalyst for a seismic shift that would reshape the landscape of Italian football forever. This is a story of corruption, manipulation, and malpractice, a story of how the battles waged off the pitch are just as tactical and fierce as those waged on it. A story that went to the very top of Italian football. This is the story of Calciopoli, a very Italian scandal. The game of football is an intricate dance of unity and separation, a phenomenon that possesses a unique ability to simultaneously bring people together and set them apart. Yet amidst this sea of divided allegiances, there exists a rare consensus among fans of all stripes. The last person anyone wants to be talking about after a game is the referee. It is a sentiment that transcends team loyalties and unites fans in their collective frustration when the performance of the referee becomes the main talking point after the final whistle is blown. Luca Palanca, once heralded as a rising star among referees, soon found himself thrust into the spotlight of scrutiny. His journey from promising official to a figure of controversy began with a series of decisions across multiple games that left many questioning his judgment. However, his performance during the Messina-Venezia game saw questions about his judgment turn into questions about his integrity. When the final whistle had blown, Palanca had dismissed 3 players, and all 3 belonged to Venezia. This was remarkably helpful to their opponents Messina, who were vying for promotion and the riches that top-flight football would bring. So dubious was Palanca's performance that it saw Franco Dalcin, the president of the Venetian club, state out loud what many in Italian football had long suspected, that there was a cabal of referees whose strings were being pulled by powerful puppet masters operating in the shadows. And Palanca was one of them. Such outbursts do not go unnoticed, particularly by those who had already begun investigating a foul smell emanating from the fabric of Italian football. Italy has always had a peculiar relationship with organized crime. Powerful groups have existed for centuries and have affected the social and economic life of many Italian regions since the 19th century and have become a defining feature of Italy's global image. And in 2002, one of the largest and most feared criminal organizations in the country came to the attention of two ambitious prosecutors in Naples. The Camorra's list of interests include narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering, facts widely known across the country. The Neapolitan authorities began investigating individuals associated with the group, and their investigations would uncover the existence of a group of football players betting on the results of matches, utilizing a dense and efficient network of information generated between them to gain financially. Could it be that there was organized and systematic corruption at the heart of the Italian game? With Dalsin talking openly about such practices, the authorities had someone who could fill in the blanks. He told the prosecutors all that they needed to hear, that it was the firm belief among many in the second division of Italian football that Messina's quest for promotion had been helped in no small part by a group of referees known as the Roman Gang. Furthermore, this group of referees had close links with one of the most powerful organizations in football, an organization that at the time represented more than 200 footballers playing in the Italian top flight, an organization under the control of one of Italian football's most powerful figures. There is perhaps no love story in the history of football as intense as that which existed between Diego Maradona and Napoli. The Argentine arrived in Naples following a tumultuous 2-year spell at Barcelona, a time marked by ill discipline, punctuated by moments of unparalleled genius. Maradona joined Barca for a world record fee and was expected to light up the Spanish top flight. However, football was a very different game to that which exists today, and a player who had the ability to win matches single-handedly became a target for those with lesser skills. Spain's defenders took no chances with Maradona, landing blow after blow in the hope of weakening his magical feat. Inevitably, this led to him suffering repeated injuries and spending prolonged periods of time on the treatment table. And it wasn't just opposition players who took aim. Despite his status as one of the most mercurial talents in the game, the Spanish public seemed decidedly cold towards him, with Maradona later revealing that he felt like an outcast during his time in Spain. He would often be subjected to racist abuse, both on and off the pitch, on account of his grandfather's Native American heritage, which gave him a slightly darker complexion. And much of this abuse came from his own fans. Maradona would eventually break free from his cold relationship with Barcelona and fall into the warm embrace of a public in desperate need of a savior. In the 1980s, Naples was a downtrodden and dysfunctional city. Years of neglect from Italian high society had led to mass poverty and unemployment. Organized crime thrived, and the city was seen as a stain on the image of Italy by the wealthy industrialists in the north. When Napoli played away from home, opposition fans would often hold up banners reading, "Welcome to Italy," and "Vesuvius washed them in fire." Chants of Naples being the sewer of Italy were commonplace. The Neapolitans were a people almost without hope. Almost. While day-to-day life may have been bleak, they always had their beloved football team, the 11 men who provided 90 minutes of escape from the world around them. 11 men who carried the hopes of a city and people on their shoulders. But much like the city and its people, the team was also crumbling, suffering under the weight of years of neglect. What Naples needed was a hero, and in July 1984, that hero arrived. Maradona was greeted by more than 70,000 ecstatic fans, in shock that a player of his caliber would be wearing their beloved blue jersey. In truth, it was the perfect relationship. Maradona, the boy born into poverty, the boy who wasn't supposed to make it, the boy who had the odds stacked against him and still overcame them, was the perfect savior. And in Naples, Maradona found not only a team but a people, city and culture that needed him as well. The working-class hero who would carry the fight to the establishment, who would slay the aristocratic clubs of Juventus and Milan. They each provided what the other needed and quickly fell in love. What Maradona achieved at the club was nothing short of astonishing. In the 2 seasons before his arrival, Napoli had twice flirted with relegation and were seen as being of no significant consequence in Italian football. But within 3 years, they would win their first Italian title and follow it with another 3 years later. This era of unprecedented success also included 2 Italian Cups and a European triumph as well. Maradona had lifted a people out of despair, allowing them to strike back at an establishment that looked upon them with disdain. Naples had never seen celebrations like it, and their number 10 was idolized. All teams have legends, but very few have a god. But Napoli did. And that was a problem. For this man. Luciano Moggi was appointed to the role of sporting director in the immediate aftermath of Napoli's first league triumph, and he quickly built a rapport with their star player. However, Moggi learned that while Maradona shone on the pitch, off the pitch a serious problem had developed that would later prove to be the downfall of the world's best player. While in Spain, Maradona had developed a taste for cocaine. However, what began as casual use grew into a full-blown addiction, something incompatible with being a top-level footballer, at least for most people. For while Maradona's off-field behavior became increasingly erratic, and he would often miss training due to his love of the Neapolitan nightlife, when on the pitch, he was still a cut above all those around him. However, it didn't take long before Maradona's wild lifestyle found itself in the pages of the Italian newspapers, who would regularly photograph him falling out of nightclubs in the early hours of the morning. Moggi, as we will learn, was a man of influence and had contacts in the media. At first, he was able to suppress stories of his star forward's behavior, but his club Napoli lacked the power to exert any real influence over Italy's corrupt and partisan media, and before long news about Maradona's drug addiction was widespread. And yet, somehow, he always managed to evade the clutches of Italy's anti-doping authorities. How could someone displaying all the hallmarks of, and widely known to be, a cocaine addict pass urine tests with flying colors? Enter Luciano Moggi. While Napoli of the 80s were far from a one-man band, it was plain for all to see that without their mercurial number 10, they would not compete for the game's top honors. Moggi knew he needed his star player on the pitch, and the anti-doping authorities represented a real threat. The solution? To provide Maradona with clean urine samples to submit to the authorities. There were even rumors that Moggi had supplied the Argentine with a prosthetic penis to dupe the investigators, and it proved to be a solution that worked. Until it didn't. In 1990, Napoli were to play Spartak Moscow in the second round of the Champions League. In the first leg of the tie, Maradona shone, putting in arguably his last great performance in a Napoli shirt. However, it was the build-up to the second leg that would spell the beginning of the end for the Argentinian and truly introduce us to the mind of Luciano Moggi. Napoli were due to fly to Russia 2 days before the tie, and the whole squad had arrived at the airport as planned. All except Diego. Infuriated by his latest display of ill discipline, a group of players went to Maradona's house only to be greeted by his then wife, who informed them that he was in no fit state to play, following yet another night of debauchery. The players and the team left without him. Eventually, he woke from his slumber and, with a deep sense of remorse, booked himself a private jet to Moscow, arriving the night before the game. But Napoli's power brokers had grown weary of his behavior and had previously warned him that he would be dropped if he did not travel with the squad to Russia. And they kept their word. Maradona began the game on the bench and was introduced in the 63rd minute. However, he was unable to lift what was a drab game that was eventually settled on penalties, with Spartak emerging victorious. The result was a catastrophe for Napoli, robbing them of vital cash and a prestigious tie with Real Madrid in the next round. Incensed, Moggi decided that Maradona's behavior could no longer be tolerated. But how to get rid of a player worshipped as a god by the club's fans? Any man who dared to sell Maradona would be lynched by a baying public. So he let the authorities carry out the assassination for him. Moggi stopped protecting their star player with clean urine, and it wasn't long before Maradona would fail a drugs test and begin his fall from grace. For Moggi, Maradona had committed the ultimate sin. He betrayed his friendship and his confidence. Born in the rolling hills of Tuscany, Luciano Moggi was a man whose dreams were bigger than his humble beginnings. Born into a world far from glamorous, Moggi left school at the age of 13 and found himself working at the local railway station. However, his passion for football, which was instilled by a local talent scout who took him to games, became the catalyst for a remarkable ascent. However, it would not be Moggi's feet that would carry him to the pinnacle of the Italian game, but his eyes and his brain. For while his ability to play the game was limited, he excelled at spotting talent in other players, and in particular young players. Working as a scout, his approach was personal, focusing not only on a player's skills, but also delving into their family situation and personality. This unique approach garnered much success, earning him the title of a second father or older brother to the players. Moggi's charisma and effective salesmanship gave him the edge, creating a network of connections that extended far beyond football. And in a move that says much about the way he worked, he would later go on to hire the very same scout who had introduced him to football as a wide-eyed 13-year-old to work for him. That was the Moggi way. Friendship and confidence. One hand washes the other. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours. His acumen and reputation would continue to flourish, eventually leading him to one of the most influential men in Italian football. A man whose tutelage would come to have a profound effect on Moggi and the whole of Italian football. Italo Elodi was every inch the smooth Italian Lothario, with a love of fine suits and even finer women. In the 1960s, he would form part of a triumvirate that would drive Inter Milan to a period of unprecedented success, culminating in 2 Italian titles and a brace of European Cups. And on the way to their second European triumph, they would cross swords with Bill Shankly's formidable Liverpool side. Liverpool secured the bragging rights in the first leg of the tie, but would come unstuck in Milan in a match that was shrouded in controversy. Inter put 3 past Shankly's men, and 2 of those goals would go down in infamy, with one scored from an indirect free kick, and the second the result of the ball being stolen out of goalkeeper Tommy Lawrence's hands and rolled into an empty net. Further controversy was to follow, with Liverpool having a crucial goal ruled out for an infringement, which to this day remains unidentified. The red half of Merseyside cried foul, claiming a shadowy hand had been at work to tilt the playing field in favour of the Italians. Sour grapes? On the surface it might appear so. However, 12 months previously, Inter had progressed to the European Cup final in equally suspicious circumstances, with the referee on that day turning a blind eye to the butchery of the Italian team. It would later be revealed that the referee in question had enjoyed an all-expenses-paid holiday on the Italian coast, all expenses paid by Inter. With the whiff of corruption already in the air, the farce in Milan saw the stench grow stronger, and Italo Allodi was the man widely believed to be at the center of it. Accusations of match-fixing had dogged him for years, although none were ever proven. Indeed, the following year, it was reported that the referee for Inter's upcoming tie with Real Madrid had been whisked to a private villa to see Allodi and Inter's other power brokers. He was showered with offers, gifts and promises, but his integrity proved too strong, and he declined their overtures, and he never refereed a European tie again. Allodi's playbook was very simple. Fixing a football match is a risky business. Players can be bribed, but things can go wrong when thousands of fans are watching. The alternative is to buy the match officials. Allegedly, of course. And it was from Allodi that Moggi would learn how to maneuver through the corridors of power. Allodi moved to Juventus several years later, and Moggi's work in spotting potential stars of the future caught his eye. He brought Moggi into the fold, and it wasn't long before Moggi would start to deploy the skills acquired from the master of manipulation himself. The 1980s marked turbulent times for Moggi as he worked his way through several clubs, refining his skills as a diplomat to rub shoulders with the most powerful men in Italian football. Moggi moved to Roma, where the first whiff of scandal would come to fill the air. On the eve of a match against Ascoli, Moggi was spotted having dinner with the referee and linesman who had been designated to officiate the match. Moggi claimed it was a perfectly innocent affair. Roma's hierarchy saw it differently and parted ways with him upon hearing the news. Roma won the game 1-0, with the match coming under scrutiny for the performance of the referee. A perfectly innocent affair. But it wasn't until 1994 when his activities would come to the attention of the Italian authorities. As sporting director of Torino, Moggi was accused of providing prostitutes to referees ahead of games as a sign of friendship, and by this point, Luciano Moggi's friendship was extremely valuable to anyone with any ambitions to succeed in football. Moggi dismissed the accusations, of course, claiming that the women were in fact interpreters. The issue was that very few of them spoke any language other than Italian. Like Allodi before him, Moggi realized it was much easier to influence the outcome of the game by befriending the referees, preying on the weaknesses at the hearts of men for women and gold. But as the world would one day learn, Moggi would go on to develop a more sophisticated and altogether more sinister method for influencing the officials. In the early 2000s, Italian football was still a fertile breeding ground for success, the promised land where the world's best players went in search of individual and collective honors. During this time, the country would produce 3 Champions League winning teams, while 3 players plying their trade in the Italian top flight would be named the best player in the world. This was also the era which saw Italian football smash the world transfer record not once, but twice within a span of 2 years, showcasing the financial and sporting prowess of its clubs to the world. Both of these deals were between Italian clubs, and while teams from the peninsula would once again feature in 2 more world record transfers during this time, they would find themselves the selling club. Because while the world record fees paid for Crespo and Vieri suggested strength and financial might, the balance sheets of many of the country's top clubs suggested otherwise. For it was around this time that the slow and steady decline of Italian football began, driven by a toxic storm of falling attendances, uneven television deals, and escalating player wages, all of which combined to expose the rot at the heart of the game. A rot born of neglect, greed, and negligence. Once proud stadiums, the cathedrals of Italian football now began to resemble dilapidated relics of a bygone era. The lack of investment in infrastructure left these venues crumbling, unable to provide fans with the modern facilities they desired. However, the decay wasn't limited to the bricks and mortar. Violence in the stadiums had become an all-too-common occurrence, tarnishing the reputation of Italian football. Hooliganism reigned unchecked, with perpetrators often evading punishment, fostering a culture of impunity that only fueled further unrest. As the stadiums decayed and violence persisted, the television deals that once fueled the financial engine of Italian football began to shrink. TV rights, once a lucrative source of revenue, failed to keep pace with the soaring demands of clubs and players alike. The lack of investment from broadcasters saw Italian football begin to trail behind its European counterparts. Amidst this backdrop of decay and stagnation, player salaries continued to soar to unprecedented heights. Italian clubs, struggling to compete financially, found themselves unable to match the lucrative offers from abroad, particularly from the cash-rich English clubs. And such pressures can very easily lead to the blurring of the line between right and wrong, testing the limits of integrity. Juventus had slipped from their lofty standards when Moggi was appointed sporting director in 1994. The old lady had failed to win the league for 8 years, which was a lifetime for the richest and most prestigious club in Italy. Which goes some way to explaining Moggi's appointment. Juventus were owned by the Agnelli family, a powerful and influential dynasty often described as the Kennedys of Italy. Their interests included the Fiat Motor Company and extended into the worlds of media, politics and finance, and the Agnellis are the personification of how power works in Italy. At the top of every society sits a powerful elite, and Italy is no exception. What distinguishes nations are the pyramids which form these powerful bases. In the United States, it comprises politics, industry, and the military. In Italy, it comprises politics, industry, and football. While these pyramids may appear distinct, they are bound together by the common thread of power, with key figures seamlessly shifting between them. The Agnelli family are a good example of this system, but nobody personified it more than this man. A successful and charismatic businessman, he owned 3 of Italy's 4 private television stations and in 1986 would acquire AC Milan, a team whose glory days were far behind them. He would go on to transform the fortunes of the club on and off the pitch, earning the adoration of millions of fans in the process. In 1992, Italy suffered one of the worst years in its recent history and presented Berlusconi with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. At the time, an anti-mafia task force had been hugely successful in bringing figures from the criminal underworld to justice. Playing a treacherous game, 2 magistrates led the fight against organized crime and corruption at the heart of Italian society, taking on the powerful figures who stole and trafficked with impunity. However, the Sicilian mafia is a dangerous opponent. There is one truth that is common to all those who occupy powerful positions, and that is that power must be protected and projected. And that is precisely what the mafia did. Two car bombs within the space of 2 months showed the world the price to be paid by those who dared to challenge the might of the mob, and Italy lost 2 men of honor and moral fortitude. Added to this was a corruption scandal involving politicians across the land, a rot that ran so deep that its exposure would lead to the collapse of several political parties. This was Berlusconi's opportunity. That same year, he announced through one of his television networks that he was to enter the world of politics, positioning himself as the man that the weary Italian public could rely on to restore the country to its former glories. He used his record at Milan and his success in the business world as proof that he was a man who would not accept second best. He would later go on to be named Prime Minister on 3 separate occasions. And we also see why the shifting sands of European football in the early 2000s posed such a threat to Italy's most prestigious clubs. It threatened the power of Italy's elite. To the uninformed, Luciano Moggi's appointment as Juventus sporting director in 1994 might appear to be something of a curious move by the Agnelli family. Juventus were the aristocrats of Italian football and were a symbol of prestige and preeminence. Moggi, meanwhile, was a rather unremarkable man at first glance. With his aquiline nose and bald head, he lacked the traditional good looks and style of those traditionally associated with the old lady. Indeed, he had been known to wipe his mouth on his tie at the end of meals with important figures. However, he had established a reputation as a shrewd and canny operator with an unrivaled eye for spotting talent, something Juventus were in desperate need of. And it was a move that would pay dividends, with the old lady winning 3 league titles and a Champions League by the turn of the millennium. As Juventus secured what they believed to be their rightful place at the pinnacle of Italian football, Luciano Moggi's stature grew to that of one of the most important men in the game. What Juventus gave to Moggi was power, and power was what he would need as the headwinds started to blow through Italian football. In the early 2000s, the procedure for assigning referees to matches in Italian football went as follows. A 2-person committee whittled down the choice of officials whose names were then drawn at random, a simple system that would ensure a fair distribution of officials across the Italian top flight. The 2 men who made up this committee were Pierluigi Piretto and Paolo Bergamo, the gatekeepers of the integrity of the Italian game. With this authority came immense responsibility, but also vulnerability. 2 ingredients a master puppeteer is only too happy to exploit, and Luciano Moggi was that master puppeteer. Over 4 decades, Moggi had ascended to the upper echelons of the game, which was no mean feat in the shark-infested waters of Italian football. And one does not find themselves in such a position without having a raft of tools at their disposal and a system in place through which to wield them. And it is here where we are introduced to the Moggi system and the currency that kept the cogs of the machine turning. Luciano Moggi's system for giving Juventus the edge over the competition was based on the notion of clientelism. At its core, clientelism involves a reciprocal relationship between a patron and a client. The client would give support to the patron, who would then reward the client for their loyalty. This system plays out every day in the world of politics, and as we have seen, the worlds of politics and football are deeply entwined in Italy. This clientelism was at the heart of Moggi's rise to the Juventus boardroom, a tale of handshakes and friendships, a tale of nods and whispers, a tale of one hand washing the other. And what makes this playbook so effective is that over time, the relationship between the 2 actors involved becomes unequal, with the patron wielding more power and influence than the client. Many corruption scandals are characterized by money-changing hands, but Moggi was far too shrewd an operator to leave a paper trail of this sort. His currency was one of gifts, but these were not gifts that came with a bow on top. These gifts were promises, promises which could be called upon at a later date, favors he could return in their hour of need, support for a promotion, securing lucrative jobs for one's children, swaying an investigator who has come a little too close for comfort. Which brings us back to Piretto and Bergamo. Depending on how you look at it, they were either good friends of Moggi's or clients. While they were both influential men in their own right, their power was dwarfed by Moggi's. After all, he was in charge of the most prestigious team in Italy and was a man who could take away just as easily as he could give. And like good friends or clients, the referee designators provided a conduit for Moggi to turn referees into clients. This meant that client referees were assigned to officiate Juventus games. There were rewards for those who complied and wrath for those who defied. Dubious penalty appeals were to be looked upon favorably. The benefit of the doubt was to be given in tight offside decisions. A blind eye was to be turned to robust challenges. With this power, Moggi could nullify the prowess of even the most formidable teams. No matter the star-studded lineup or the strategic brilliance of a manager, the whims of a single referee hold the power to shape the outcome of a match. In the presence of manipulation, the playing field is no longer level. It tilts precariously under the weight of misconduct and deceit. But his machinations didn't stop there. He would also implore the designators to select certain referees to officiate games involving their direct rivals, as well as coercing the referee to book or send off the star players of Juventus's next opponents, therefore ruling them out of the fixture with the old lady. Some referees, brave enough to defy the puppeteer's demands, dared to stand firm in the face of manipulation. For a master puppeteer, such defiance cannot be tolerated, a blemish on his carefully cultivated image of invincibility. Defiance is not merely met with a stern rebuke, but with consequences that serve as a chilling warning to all who would dare challenge his authority. For in his world, obedience is paramount, and those who dare to obstruct his path must be swiftly and mercilessly dealt with. And Moggi knew just the way to do it. In the corridors of media houses and newsrooms, journalists tread a delicate tightrope between access and integrity, between power and principle. In their pursuit of truth and career advancement, they often find themselves at the mercy of those in positions of authority. Access to powerful figures can make or break a journalist's career. Moggi understood that to truly control the game, he needed to control the narrative as well. He therefore needed to control the media, the gatekeepers of public perception. His logic was that though 50,000 might see the game live, millions had their opinions formed by the work of journalists such as this man. Aldo Biscardi presented one of the most popular football shows in Italy, beamed to millions of homes across the country to digest events on and off the field. The commentators dissected every aspect of top-flight matches, including the performance of referees. This made men like Biscardi important clients of Moggi's. Because referees who failed to toe the party line risked crucifixion in print and on screen, their every mistake magnified and dissected for the world to see, even mistakes they didn't make. Their integrity would be called into question, their abilities doubted, their very livelihoods threatened, their reputations shattered. And with that, their hopes of officiating the most prestigious fixtures, both domestically and internationally, would be in tatters. We see here the unequal relationship between patron and client. But what did the journalists receive for their part in the bargain? They received the one thing that all journalists crave, a reliable source. If they wanted Juventus players on their shows, they needed Moggi's assent. If they wanted access to Juventus's ground, they needed Moggi's permission. If they wanted to be the first to know of a future superstar joining the club, they needed Moggi's friendship. It was in this way that the network of the news media system met the network of corruption, thanks to journalists that offered themselves to the corrupter and did not defend their professional autonomy, preferring the certainty of the secure and powerful support of Luciano Moggi to the search for and publication of the truth. Moggi would also handpick topics for discussion on many shows, suggesting footage that painted Juventus in a favorable light and maneuvered the opinions of the commentators, who played along with his game with great willingness. Their loyalty bought and paid for with access to players and privileged information. But while many were only too willing to entangle themselves in this web of complicity and trust, there were those who stood firm against the tide of manipulation, refusing to bow to the pressures of power and greed. One such brave soul was this lady. Francesca, with a fierce determination to conduct her work with integrity, found herself in Moggi's sights for her non-compliance. As the wheels of corruption turned, Francesca found herself marginalized and excluded from broadcasts, her voice silenced. By the invisible hand of Moggi's influence, she spoke out against the injustice, decrying her disadvantaged position in the world of sports broadcasting. Yet, her protests fell on deaf ears, suffocated by the cacophony of corruption that surrounded her. However, Francesca would one day have her day in court. While having referees and journalists dancing to his tune gave Moggi an edge over the competition, it would all count for nothing if the players donning the black and white stripes were not of a high enough standard. There is only so far a dishonest referee can mask the differences between two teams, and there are limits as to how far journalists can manipulate the Italian public's perception. Moggi therefore needed influence over the players, and he did this through his son Alessandro and his sports agency G.E.A World. Founded in 2001, the agency represented some of the most esteemed names in the Italian game, and at one point was responsible for more than 20% of players plying their trade in the Italian top flight. Moggi, the master strategist, utilized his son's agency as a vehicle to mold the landscape of Italian football to his liking. Through strategic maneuvers and behind-the-scenes machinations, G.E.A World exerted pressure on clubs to purchase certain players and appoint managers favored by the agency, further cementing its grip on the Italian game. But G.E.A World also served as a vehicle in which Moggi could repay favors to those clients who had helped him climb to the top of the game. Many sons and daughters of the rich and powerful, stretching from football to banking, found themselves with places on the board, demonstrating once again how the power pyramids at the top of Italian society operate. But G.E.A World would also become the first card to fall in the collapse of the Moggi system. Football, revered as the great equalizer, thrives on the foundational belief in a level playing field where talent, skill, and dedication reign supreme. It is a sanctuary where fans seek refuge from the complexities of the world, drawn to the purity of competition and the thrill of uncertainty. Yet underlying this reverence lies a delicate trust, an unspoken agreement between players, fans, and the sporting institutions that the game will be fair and just. For fans, this belief in fairness is sacrosanct. It is the thread that weaves their passion into the fabric of the sport, binding them to its highs and lows. To question the integrity of the game is to shake the very foundation of their devotion, igniting howls of indignation that reverberate across stadiums and living rooms alike. For fans invest not just their time and money, but their emotions in the belief that the outcome of a match is determined solely by the quality of the players and the decisions of the referees. In the corridors of power, secrecy is the armor that shields the manipulators from the harsh light of scrutiny. It is the cloak that shrouds their intentions, allowing them to maneuver in the shadows, unseen and unchecked. Behind closed doors, they orchestrate their schemes, weaving webs of deceit and manipulation with precision. However, when secrecy fails, the facade crumbles, and the manipulators find themselves exposed, vulnerable to the piercing gaze of public scrutiny. In the unforgiving glare of truth, their carefully constructed narratives unravel, revealing the ugly truth beneath the veneer of power. Suddenly, there is nowhere to hide, no sanctuary from the damning spotlight of accountability. We stated earlier that power is something that must be protected and projected, and secrecy was the protection that was critical to the so-called Moggi system. And when that failed, the writing was on the wall. But how did the world come to know about what was going on? To answer that, we need to say hello once again to our old friend Luca Palanca. Despite its reputation for being dysfunctional and corrupt, there are those in the Italian legal system who approach their work with dignity and integrity, striving to ensure that the long arm of the law can reach all members of society, regardless of power or privilege. In 2004, the Neapolitan authorities had begun an investigation into organized crime, and it wasn't long before they learned of a group of players complicit in match fixing. With the integrity of the game at stake, they instigated a wiretap operation, eavesdropping on whispered conversations containing carefully guarded secrets. What was once hidden behind closed doors was now exposed to the bright lights of scrutiny. With each intercepted call, the veil of secrecy that shrouded the perpetrators was lifted, revealing the true extent of their misdeeds. And the words of one man in particular would prove to be the spark that would lead to the downfall of one of the most powerful men in the world of football. Salvatore Ambrosino's career was spent in the lower echelons of Italian football, and were it not for his loose tongue, his name would be nothing more than a footnote in the history of the game. While he may be of little interest to football historians, he would become a man of great interest to the Neapolitan prosecutors. On the eve of the Messina-Venezia game, Ambrosino was recorded in conversation with a man by the name of Luigi Saracino, the owner of a sports betting agency. During this conversation, Ambrosino suggested that Messina would emerge victorious, because the black man was okay with it. The black man? While those suspected of rigging the game were unaware they were being listened to, they were still wise enough to use coded language to disguise their misdeeds. Aside from the black man, there was also the handsome one, the relative, the saint, and the great boss. With Ambrosino's words and Palanca's dubious performance, the authorities knew they had stumbled across something that could upend the whole edifice of Italian football. They just needed someone to decipher the code. Ambrosino was apprehended by the authorities, and with the writing on the wall, he spilled the beans and revealed the meanings behind the coded language. The black man was used to refer to referees. The handsome one was Sampdoria fullback Stefano Betterini. The saint was Cagliari sporting director Nicola Salerno, and the great boss was Romano Amadei, the president of Modena. With Ambrosino caught on tape claiming the black man was happy with Messina beating Venezia, the prosecutors had found the loose thread that would lead to the unraveling of the clandestine tapestry woven into Italian football. It was discovered that Messina had close links to the power brokers at Juventus and at G.E.A. It was also revealed that the Roman gang of referees were also closely linked to G.E.A., and G.E.A. was closely linked to Luciano Moggi. With one door leading to another, the authorities expanded their wiretap operation to include those associated with G.E.A., including Luciano Moggi. With the cloak of secrecy torn asunder, the master puppeteer was stripped of his illusion of invincibility. The once impenetrable fortress of whispers and shadows had become nothing more than a house of cards, which would soon collapse under the weight of scrutiny. The wiretaps revealed the conversations between Moggi and the different clients in his network of power, the referee designators, the referees themselves, journalists, and even those at the head of the Italian Football Association. The wiretaps also revealed that Luciano Moggi was not the only one. It is at this point that we need to introduce ourselves to some of the other players who would come to be exposed in this game of deceit and duplicity. No team in Italian football has ever been crowned champions of Europe more times than AC Milan. In 2003, Milan would win their 6th European crown, beating none other than Luciano Moggi's Juventus. Milan also boasted 17 league titles, and 4 of their 6 European crowns were acquired under the stewardship of this man. Adriano Galliani was as equally formidable as Moggi, his shrewd business acumen and unwavering determination driving AC Milan to 7 league titles and 4 Champions Leagues during his tenure. Like a chess grandmaster, he plotted his moves carefully, leveraging his club's prestige and financial power to outmaneuver his rivals. Galliani's ascent to the upper echelons of power was no accident. Like Moggi, he navigated the corridors of power with skill and finesse, securing influential positions, including president of the governing body of Italian football and membership of the prestigious G14 lobbying group, which represented the most powerful clubs in Europe. Remarkably, he held these positions while also serving as president of AC Milan, a testament to his unparalleled influence and prowess in the world of football. Via the club's referee liaison officer Leonardo Meani, Galliani would employ the same tools as Moggi, influencing the selection of referees while leaving journalists with no choice but to fall into line if they wanted access to the club's stars. Another whose face we shall be seeing more of is this man. Antonio Giraudo was the chief executive of Juventus during Moggi's tenure, and together with Roberto Bettega, the three would become known as the Triad. Bettega's role in this story is a minor one. Giraudo's, however, was not. We must also introduce ourselves to the Vice President of the Italian Football Federation, Innocenzo Mazzini, to referee Massimo De Santis, and to the then President of Fiorentina, Diego Della Valle. However, before their stories are told, we must return to G.E.A, the first domino to fall in the so-called Moggi system, because the Neapolitan authorities were not the only ones who had taken an interest in the company's activities. Prosecutors in Rome had noticed the rather large conflict of interest in a sports agency representing more than 1/5 of players in the Italian top flight being strongly linked to one of the most powerful men in world football. The Roman authorities launched their own investigations into the company, meaning Moggi had two different legal entities in two different jurisdictions taking an interest in his affairs. In addition, prosecutors in Turin, incensed by the doping scandal that shrouded Juventus in the mid to late 90s, also began tapping the phones of those associated with the club, believing there were deeper layers of corruption waiting to be exposed. As the authorities pieced together the puzzle, they learned how the rulers of the country's most powerful clubs manipulated the beautiful game, the game so adored by the Italian public. And they also learned that G.E.A was a firm created with the aim of acquiring the greatest number of sporting rights and attaining a contractual power capable of influencing the transfer market. They uncovered evidence of what they believed showed G.E.A using the tactics of intimidation and threats of violence to force players, agents and managers to fall into line. Day after day they listened, their wiretaps numbering nearly 200,000 and stretching over 7,500 pages. And in those pages was what they believed to be evidence of Luciano Moggi exploiting the power and force of intimidation, displaying an unnerving ability to overwhelm players, presidents, and those charged with maintaining the integrity of the game. And it was one of those tasked with governing Italian football that first learned of what the prosecutors had discovered. Perhaps no man exemplifies the game of musical chairs at the top of Italian society more than this man. As president of the Italian Football Federation, Franco Carraro was a towering figure in the Italian game, a man who had climbed to the top in much the same way as Moggi, by making powerful friends in powerful places. His distinguished career also included 3 terms as president of the Italian League, in addition to being a former president of AC Milan and president of the Italian Olympic Organization. Added to that, he was also a banker, a former mayor of Rome, and minister of tourism for the Italian Socialists. In his position as president of the Italian Football Federation, Franco Carraro bore ultimate responsibility when it came to the running of the game. And it was he who was the first to be presented with evidence of manipulation on his watch. However, this would not be the first scandal he was involved in, and it wouldn't be the first scandal where his judgment was called into question. In 2001, there were limits as to how many overseas players Italian teams were allowed to field. While Italy had produced many of the finest footballers in the world, Latin America has arguably given birth to more of the game's greats. One such player tipped for greatness was Alvaro Recoba, the Uruguayan forward blessed with a wand of a left foot. There was just one problem: his passport. His club Inter Milan was home to many fine players from South America, and restrictions on foreign players meant they were unable to field them all. And the disciplinary committee of Italian football discovered he was one of a number of players who had acquired false European passports to allow their clubs to skirt the rules surrounding non-EU players. While many of the players received year-long bans for their misconduct, there were calls for Inter to be punished. After all, they were the facilitators of the scheme and ultimately benefited from it. According to Italian rules, Inter should have been deducted a point from all those earned with Recoba on the pitch, which would have seen them relegated from the Italian top flight. A seismic event indeed, given their status as one of Italian football's most illustrious clubs. And the decision rested on the shoulders of Franco Carraro. His decision? He refused to put Inter on trial, and Italian football carried on as normal. It is said that true character is revealed by the decisions a man takes when under pressure. So when Carraro was presented with evidence of a web of manipulation deeply entrenched in Italian football, he was faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, he could fulfill his duties as steward of the game's moral compass and bring the perpetrators to justice. However, to do so would be to damage the reputation of a league already staring decline in the face, or he could dismiss the evidence and protect one of the pillars of Italian society. He chose the latter. Once born, however, scandals involving powerful figures rarely allow themselves to be contained. While Carraro was keen to turn a blind eye, there were those who felt justice needed to be served, and if the perpetrators were not to be tried in the courts of Italian football, they were to be tried in the court of public opinion. Wiretaps began to leak. Drip by drip, the private conversations between Moggi and the power brokers of Italian football had fallen into the hands of journalists. They had robust evidence of what many had long suspected. And yet the first outlet to obtain the wiretaps, Gazzetta dello Sport, made scant reference to them initially. Why, with such an enormous scoop on its hands, would the sports newspaper with the highest circulation in Italy not splash the contents on the front page for the world to see? A scandal involving the world of football is a highly newsworthy event, especially in Italy, and media outlets that have to sell advertising space cannot refuse to cover such a major story. And the answer is simple. The wealthy elites who owned football clubs and businesses also controlled media outlets. So when the wiretaps were leaked, the response of the newspapers was restrained precisely because many of the owners of these outlets also owned sizable stakes in the clubs implicated. However, the wiretaps were leaked to more outlets. Whispers among the general public grew louder. The dam was about to burst. This was a story that could no longer be stemmed, and on the 2nd of May 2006, the dam broke, spilling the contents of corruption at the heart of Italian football into the open for all to see. Newspaper circulations rocketed, the airwaves filled with howls of indignation, the shadows that once protected the power brokers of Italian football destroyed by the light of public scrutiny. Luciano Moggi, the general manager of Juventus, Italy's most successful club, was situated at the nexus of a wide network of journalists, referees, politicians and administrators whom he used to manipulate the game to maintain Juventus's place at the top of Italian football. And with that, the Calciopoli scandal was born. Amidst the howls of indignation, the Italian Football Federation had no choice but to open an investigation into the matter. Carraro's attempts to suppress the evidence had failed, and one by one, the dominoes began to fall. Carraro himself was the first to fall, having nowhere to go after being found to be an inadequate president. He was quickly followed by Innocenzo Mazzini, who worked as his understudy. The resignation of the entire Juventus board came not long after. Luciano Moggi, who had been named as the chief protagonist in this tragicomedy, stepped down a few days later. However, it would transpire that while Moggi may have been the most effective operator, the wiretaps showed he was far from alone, as the Neapolitan prosecutors would reveal that over 40 people were being entered into the register of suspects. and they spanned a multitude of clubs across the Italian top flight. As well as executives, several referees and journalists were named by the authorities. The entire house of cards that had propped up Italian football was on the brink of collapse. In total, 19 top-flight matches were investigated between November 2004 and May 2005, 7 of which involved Juventus. The myriad of charges brought against the accused was almost as complex as the networks they allegedly built to manipulate the game and included sporting fraud, criminal association with a view to committing sporting fraud, and embezzlement. Those supposedly at the heart of the scheme were facing trials on two fronts: sporting charges and criminal charges. As our story unfolds, a pivotal moment presents itself, offering us two divergent paths. One option leads us down the winding corridors of legal disputes, a labyrinth spanning years and still casting its shadows nearly 2 decades later. Yet there exists an alternative, a choice to delve deeper, to unravel the layers beneath the surface. Because for many, the way the situation was handled was even more of a scandal than the scandal itself. In the narrative that follows, we opt for the latter course, peering beneath the veneer to uncover the truths that lie beneath. But first, let us address the punishments that befell those accused. As we have seen, Italy is no stranger to corruption scandals, and it is par for the course that those involved usually escape with a slap on the wrist and a warning not to misbehave again. Not this time. In the initial charges, Juventus, the club at the center of the investigation, were stripped of not only the title they won in the 2004-2005 season, but also the 2005-2006 championship, even though no games in that season were deemed to be suspicious. In addition, the Old Lady were banished to the second tier of Italian football and would start the following season with a 30-point deduction. Relegation would also be the punishment for Fiorentina and Lazio. Milan, the other behemoth of Italian football, would avoid being relegated, but were hit with a 44-point penalty applied to the 2005-2006 season and a 15-point penalty for the coming season. The Old Lady's 30-point penalty would eventually be reduced to 9 points, and Fiorentina and Lazio would have their relegations quashed on appeal, although points penalties were still imposed. Milan's points penalty would be settled at 30. And what of the men accused of being the masterminds behind this whole sorry affair? The heaviest penalties fell on Luciano Moggi and Juventus director Antonio Giraudo. Both were handed 5-year prohibition orders with recommendations for lifetime bans thereafter. Of the 2 referee designators, only Piretto was sanctioned, receiving a ban of 2.5 years. Adriano Galliani, the overseer of Milan, was hit with a 12-month ban from football and forced to step down from his other powerful positions. His ban would later be reduced to 5 months, while the presidents of Fiorentina and Lazio would be banned for 4 and 12 months respectively. And there it was. In the space of a few tumultuous months, lucky Luciano Moggi, the man who had climbed his way to the pinnacle of Italian football, had suffered one of the most spectacular falls from grace ever witnessed in professional sport. The criminal trials were just as tortuous as the sporting trials, filled with claim and counterclaim and moved at a snail's pace owing to the painfully slow Italian legal system. Given the tedium of the proceedings, we shall summarize them succinctly and move on to more interesting matters. With regards to the criminal trial surrounding G.E.A, Moggi and his son Alessandro were both handed custodial sentences. However, their legal teams swiftly lodged appeals, contesting the verdicts. After a lengthy legal tug-of-war, the higher courts overturned the initial rulings in 2014, sparing them from serving time behind bars. The criminal trial associated with the wider scandal also saw Luciano handed a custodial sentence. However, relentless appeals gradually chipped away at the charges against him. By 2015, the Supreme Court issued its definitive verdict, declaring Moggi acquitted of certain counts of sports fraud. However, the shadow of Calciopoli still lingered, as he was not absolved of his role as the alleged promoter of the scandalous conspiracy. The legal wrangling didn't yield uniform outcomes for all involved. While many had their convictions overturned, referee Massimo De Santis wasn't as fortunate. His 1-year suspended sentence remained intact even after the dust of appeals had settled. In the end, amidst the labyrinthine complexities of the legal system and the tumultuous back and forth of courtroom battles, the legacy of the scandal was etched with shades of grey. And it is these shades of grey that we must explore to conclude our story. The name of Italian football had been severely tarnished by the behaviour of its most prestigious clubs. Beloved institutions widely admired around the world now stood stained and diminished, with their names synonymous with corruption, greed, and manipulation. And yet the astute observer will have noticed the enormous black and blue elephant not in the room. Amidst all the scandal and shame engulfing the Italian game, there stood one club who refused to lower themselves to the level of their competitors. A club that believed strongly in the ideals of fair play and the best team wins. A bastion of integrity and decorum. Inter Milan stood as a shining light, an example of all that was holy and pure, a saint amongst the sinners, a dove amongst the hawks. At least, that's how it appeared on the surface. But scratch a little deeper, and the scandal starts to look like possibly the biggest coup ever witnessed in the world of football. As we have already touched upon, the Calciopoli scandal involved both criminal and sporting charges. While the criminal aspects were under the purview of the prosecutors in Naples and Rome, the sporting implications fell within the jurisdiction of the Italian Football Federation, the now disgraced governing body of Italian football. There was just one problem, however. The wiretaps revealed that its leaders Franco Carraro and Innocenzo Mazzini were themselves involved in the scandal, and both men had relinquished their positions following the exposure. Decapitated and rudderless, the Italian Football Federation was in no position to carry out the required investigation, and yet the public's fury demanded one. With public outcry mounting for a thorough examination, a pressing question emerged. Who would step forward to lead the Federation out of this quandary? The task demanded someone untouched by the stain of scandal, a figure of unimpeachable integrity. Yet as the wiretaps laid bare the extent of corruption permeating Italian football, the pool of trustworthy candidates seemed perilously shallow. And it was the job of the Italian National Olympic Society, the governing body of sport in the country, to select the right candidate. And in their eyes, the right candidate was this man. Guido Rossi was the man chosen to replace the fallen Carraro, charged with bringing the scandal to a swift and decisive conclusion so as not to jeopardize Italy's chances of success in the coming World Cup. That made him a man of immense power, the man with the future of Italian football in the palm of his hand. And Rossi appointed a 3-person panel, dubbed the Three Wise Men, to consider the issue of whether the Italian title of the same year should be awarded to another team in the event that the winners, Juventus, were found to be guilty of any sporting offences. They concluded that the Italian Football Federation in such cases had 2 options: to allow the title to remain in the hands of the designated winners, or to not award it at all. Rossi, every inch the clever and competent lawyer, read between the lines and awarded the title to Inter on the basis that once the points deductions were taken into account, Inter were top of the league. And now would be a good time for us to look a little deeper into Rossi. Who was this bespectacled man who had delivered one of the most seismic rulings in the history of world football? Like so many members of the Italian elite, the Harvard-educated Rossi had a distinguished CV, which included roles in the world of business, politics, and football. His various roles before the scandal are of little relevance to this story, except that is for 2. The first is that he was the former president of Telecom Italia, the largest telecommunications provider in Italy, something we will come back to later. The second is that he had previously been a member of the board of directors of Inter Milan for 4 years and was a die-hard Inter fan. So when he awarded Inter the title, there were inevitable cries of foul play, that Inter had hijacked the proceedings to deliver crushing punishments to rivals that they were unable to conquer on the pitch. Inter Milan had long been seen as the third wheel of Italian football, powerful and successful, but not as powerful and successful as either Juventus or their neighbours in red and black. For Inter fans, the rulings confirmed what they had long complained of, that everything was fixed, from victories to defeats, from penalties to offsides, and that this was the reason why their beloved team had spent so long in the shadows of their illustrious rivals. But as we have learned, the shadows are a place where a great many things can take place, and many believed that Inter had used them to greater effect than anyone else. Naturally, Rossi denied claims of foul play, but his denials did little to quell the anger of the punished clubs, who didn't hesitate to suggest that the shadowy hand of Inter Milan was pulling the strings of this seemingly affable man. And what of his role at the head of Telecom Italia? What relevance does that have to the whole affair? The authorities were able to uncover the murky workings of Italian football through wiretaps, listening to the calls of football's power brokers as they sought the advantage in their quest to top the Italian table. And it was Telecom Italia who authorized the wiretaps that would ultimately lead to the downfall of Inter's rivals. On face value, this would seem a rather logical part of the tale. The largest telecommunications company in the country would be the perfect organization to capture the recordings the authorities wanted. But as we have seen in Italian football, it is foolish to take anything at face value, because if we dig a little deeper, we find that the president of the company at the time was this man. As well as presiding over the telecommunications giant, he also happened to be the second largest shareholder in Inter Milan and a close personal friend of this man. This meant that people with very close connections to Inter were essentially in charge of who the prosecutors could and couldn't listen to and what they could and couldn't hear. And those who believed the whole affair was concocted by the blue and black half of Milan had their conspiracy theories fueled further by the role of this man. As we've seen, the ownership of Italian media outlets overlaps with ownership of its football clubs, and that was the case with the first newspaper to publish the transcripts, Gazzetta dello Sport. And as you have probably guessed by now, the owner of the paper was Carlo Buora, and he was heavily linked to Inter. He was vice president of the club. And the plot only gets thicker from here, as he also happened to be a board member of Telecom Italia alongside Provera, as was Inter Milan president Massimo Moratti. The triad of Rossi, Provera and Buora all had undeniable links to Inter Milan, and all were pivotal in how the scandal played out, reshaping the landscape of Italian football, much to the benefit of the Nerazzurri. As we peel back the layers of this sordid story, we are forced to ask ourselves, was the whole scandal concocted by Inter, the bridesmaid, but never the bride, the third wheel of Italian football? Was it the brainchild of President Massimo Moratti, a man who had poured his heart and soul into the club, not to mention millions of pounds, a man who had grown weary of his team living in the shadows of its illustrious rivals? Was the scandal that brought down some of the most powerful figures in Italian football actually the greatest coup the world of football has ever seen? Naturally, those associated with Inter denied any involvement in the proceedings. As the years passed, the dust did not settle, and cries of a coup grew louder. Moggi's legal team were able to provide transcripts of phone calls between Inter Milan's bigwigs and the very same referee designators Moggi had pressured, leaving the Italian public in no doubt that Inter had been as much involved as everyone else. And the twists and turns did not stop there. Among the key figures in this saga was Attilio Auricchio, a significant figure within the Carabinieri, one of Italy's prominent law enforcement agencies. His role was pivotal, as it was he who was entrusted with the crucial task of transcribing the intercepted calls. Auricchio's testimony later revealed a troubling directive. He stated under oath that he had been specifically instructed to focus solely on calls related to Juventus, while ignoring any communications involving Inter Milan. This revelation would cast an even larger shadow of doubt over the integrity of the sporting investigation and raised serious questions about selective treatment and bias. Ultimately, Inter's influence over the telecommunications infrastructure protected them, and the statute of limitations meant that by the time the revelations were made, the long arm of the law was unable to reach them. It all adds up to a very effective coup, depending on who you support, that is. For years, barbs have been traded, with Juventus fighting to have their stripped titles handed back to them and seeking damages for the way they were punished. After all, it is worth pointing out that the prosecutors in the sporting trials would eventually conclude that they were not guilty of breaches of the sporting code, but Inter were. The titles were never reinstated, and Inter would go on to enjoy one of the most successful periods in their history. It wasn't long before Juventus were promoted back to the Italian top flight and would go on to win 9 consecutive titles between 2011 and 2020. Juventus may have been down, but they are never out. In the world of football, few tales are as intricate and contentious as that of Calciopoli. It is a narrative that shifts shape depending on who tells it, a mosaic of fact and fiction that challenges even the most diligent of truth seekers. Its narratives are as varied as the colors of the teams it involved, each person shaping the story through their own lens of perception and bias. Our endeavor has been to untangle this web, to discern reality from myth in this gripping saga. What sets Calciopoli apart is its complexity, a sophisticated web of deceit and manipulation that did not involve the traditional exchange of money, but rather the abuse of power and influence. The quest for power between football clubs is a relentless journey fraught with challenges and temptations. At the helm of these institutions are executives who bear the weight of maintaining these colossal entities cherished by millions, with fans' unwavering demand for success allowing no failure. Executives face a myriad of pressures, from ensuring success on the pitch to navigating complex financial landscapes and managing egos within the club. The relentless pursuit of dominance can awaken Machiavellian tendencies, where the end justifies the means, and ethical lines blur in the name of securing power and influence. The executives embroiled in the scandal orchestrated a system of sophisticated and discreet maneuvers, wielding power like a finely honed blade. Behind closed doors, alliances were forged, favors were exchanged, and the relentless thirst for victory drove these figures to push the boundaries of fair play to maintain their club's status and influence. On the pitch, battles were waged with passion and skill, but off the pitch, executives engaged in a different kind of warfare, using every tool at their disposal to outmaneuver rivals and secure advantages. The scandal laid bare the lengths to which they were willing to go in the pressure cooker of top-level football, where the stakes were not just about trophies, but about preserving reputations and legacies. Like many intricate narratives, Calciopoli has suffered from widespread misunderstanding, particularly beyond Italy's borders. Distinguishing between truth and fabrication has proven to be a formidable task. Our quest has been to peel back the layers of misinterpretation and deceit, delving into the nuances of this saga. We've delved into the Moggi system, dissecting its complexities and the interplay of its components, revealing a sophisticated mechanism crafted by a master puppeteer. However, we've also strived to demonstrate that while Moggi may have been the public face of this scandal, he was not its sole architect, and the stain of infamy should not rest solely upon his shoulders.